Puck around and find out.
Welcome to the Puck Around and Find Out podcast, episode 1. The NHL season is kicking off, and I've already got a copy of the script. I explain why Ovechkin and McDavid are better than Sidney Crosby, answer your questions, and a little bit about Star Wars today on Puck Around and Find Out. If you have ever worked in a corporate job, or maybe you've worked at an office where there's a lot of older employees, maybe some people who are Gen X or boomers, you'll often run into sort of a common problem, which is you see an issue or you see a way that your colleagues are doing things, and you notice that there's kind of a obvious flaw that could be easily fixed. You'll bring it up to your boss or a colleague, and you'll get the response of, well, that's just the way we always do it. And it never gets done because they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to have to train up everybody else on a new system, which might be more effective, so it stays the way it is. And that kind of entrenched thinking is in every sort of industry: entertainment, politics, healthcare, law, sports. In hockey, there's been a lot of talk about fancy stats, analytics, and all of that stuff, with some pushback still. And that's meant that we've moved away from a lot of the quote-unquote bad stats, like plus minus is hardly ever used anymore as an evaluation of whether or not a player is good defensively or not. Because we understand that just boiling it down to whether a player is on the ice for goals or not doesn't really paint the whole picture. And there's one other stat that I think is kind of outdated that we continue to use almost unthinking, and that is points. Every hockey fan knows what the point stats are. It's goals plus assists. We give out awards to the players with the most points. We rave about players' points per game. But therein lies the problem, because in my opinion, points is based off of a faulty assumption, which is that goals and assists are worth the same. And I think there are two main reasons for this. If you were explaining hockey to somebody who's completely new to the game, somebody who had never heard of it, never seen it, had no idea what it was, they'd probably ask you, what's the point of the game? And if you wanted to tell them in the simplest fashion possible, what you would say is the object of the game is to put the puck in the opponent's net more times than they put the puck into your net before time runs out. Because that is the core essence of hockey: score more goals than your opponent before time expires. And so somebody hearing that description would naturally think, well, the two biggest skills that make somebody an elite player are being able to either put the puck into the net or keep the puck out of your net. And while there is certainly a lot more nuance that goes into how a team scores goals and how they prevent goals from being scored, that is essentially correct. We judge the outcome of a hockey game on how many goals are scored, not how many goals and assists are scored. A goal in a game of hockey counts the exact same, whether it is assisted by two people, one person, or unassisted. And also logically, assists are completely dependent on goals. You can make the ideal pass. You could be an incredible creator, but if you pass it to somebody who just shanks every shot, you're not going to get any assists. The outcome of whether or not you get an assist is largely outside of your control. Whereas you could get a lot of really bad passes, but if you just shoot them on net and they manage to go in, it counts as a goal. Goals are the fundamental measure of any game of hockey, so it makes sense that they should be worth more than assists. But there's also the fact that there are just fewer goals than assists. On any given goal, there can be 1, 2, or 0 assists. And last year, there were about 9,000 goals scored and about 15,000 assists recorded on those goals. And basic economics lesson, the more common something is, the more of them that there are in the supply, the less that they cost, or rather, the less that they are worth. So last year, there were 1.67 repeating assists for every goal scored. And that ratio means that every assist is worth basically 0.62 of every one goal. Yet the point statistic treats every goal and every assist counting exactly the same. But the analytics site Hockey Reference actually has a better stat, in my opinion, for measuring offensive output, called goals created. Let's use that context to revisit one of the statements I made during one of my preview videos about the Pittsburgh Penguins, where I said that Sidney Crosby is not as good as Connor McDavid or Alex Ovechkin because he has played with much more help on his team than either the other two did. And before we get into the specifics, I want to acknowledge really quick that I actually was kind of wrong in that statement, and I'll explain why. But I wasn't entirely wrong, and I'll justify why I still think that opinion still holds water. Over the course of his career, Sidney Crosby has a career goals created per game of 0.46. We're going by per game because Crosby missed a lot of time due to injury and stuff like that, so I want to make it on the per game basis to get ahead of the argument that the stat doesn't reflect the time that he's lost. This is on a per game basis. And I'll link to all of these stats, by the way, in the description of this video. So Crosby's at 0.46. Connor McDavid over his career has a 0.55 goals created per game. Okay, he's ahead of Sid. Now Ovechkin's goals created per game over his career is 0.46. He's tied with Sidney Crosby. So offensively, they have been equally as efficient. But what I said was that Crosby's had an advantage over those two as he's gotten to play with better supporting players, notably Evgeny Malkin. And let's take a look at Evgeny Malkin. Over his career, his goals created per game is 0.43. He's just behind Ovechkin and Crosby. So it seems fair to say that Sidney Crosby got a lot of help by being able to play with Evgeny Malkin, who has been almost as efficient offensively over his career as Crosby has been. But a lot of people retorted in the comments, well, Ovechkin got to play with Backstrom, McDavid gets to play with Draisaitl. What about those two? And this is where I was wrong, because Leon Draisaitl's goals created per game is actually higher than Evgeny Malkin's. It's 0.45, just below Crosby and Ovechkin, but still higher than Malkin. So Connor McDavid has actually gotten a lot more help than I gave him credit for. But I would also counter and say that McDavid is way ahead of Malkin, Crosby, Ovechkin, and Draisaitl. They're all very close together. McDavid is on a whole other level. However, I will concede that I was wrong to say that McDavid has not gotten help the way Crosby has, because Leon Draisaitl has been as offensively productive as Crosby and Ovechkin, and more so than Malkin. But then there are the people who retort, well, Ovechkin also gets to play with Backstrom. Nick Backstrom's career goals created per game is 0.32. The gap between him and Alex Ovechkin in terms of production is bigger than the gap between Connor McDavid and all the other players that we've talked about. In fact, if we look at the gaps between the three pairs of teammates, the gap between Ovechkin and Backstrom is the biggest, then McDavid and Draisaitl, because McDavid is on another planet, and then Crosby and Malkin are the two closest in terms of their productivity. So yeah, I was wrong to say that McDavid has not gotten the same level of help that Crosby has. But I was right to say that Ovechkin has not. And Ovechkin has performed as efficiently as Crosby with less help, while Malkin, with the same amount of help, has far outperformed Crosby. Last year, Connor McDavid was #1 in the league in goals created per game. Alex Ovechkin was 17th in the league. Sidney Crosby was 25th. There have been 6 times in his career where Crosby was not the leading goals created leader on his team. By contrast, that only happened twice to Ovechkin and once to McDavid. The simple fact of the matter is that Sidney Crosby has played with one of the best supporting casts in the NHL for years now, and that has been a large contributing factor to his productivity. In fairness, Connor McDavid has also gotten that same privilege by being able to play with Leon Draisaitl, who is a bona fide superstar in his own right, but McDavid has vastly outproduced Crosby. And those who allege that Alex Ovechkin has had a similar level of support as Crosby had throughout his career is just plain wrong. Nick Backstrom is a great player. I love him to death, but he is not on the level of Malkin or Draisaitl. And despite having the worst supporting cast around him of the three, Alex Ovechkin is still equally as productive as Sidney Crosby. Oh, and of course, he's on pace to pass Wayne Gretzky as the all-time goals leader. So the simple fact of the matter is, when we're talking about the best players of this generation, you got McDavid and Ovechkin up top, and then there's everybody else. So everybody's doing their preseason predictions. Guess it's time for me to throw mine in. I talked about them a little bit with each team on the Fuck Your Team previews, but I didn't really go into where I actually have each team in the playoff picture going into this year. So I went to one of my favorite sites, Hockey Reference, and they have a great stat called Point Share. It combines the offensive and defensive contributions of each player to account for how many points, and that's points earned by each team, that player was responsible for. Essentially, they're trying to account for how much each player contributed to their team's overall success on a year-to-year basis. So what I did was I took every team's projected starting roster, and I averaged out the point share for each player on a per-game basis, so over an 82-game season, for the last 3 years, so as to give kind of an accurate picture of how each player has performed recently. And what I did is I took those averages, projected them out over an 82-game season, and I adjusted them based on players' ages. For players under the age of 23, I added a 20% bump in their production because I'm assuming those young players are going to develop. For players aged 23 to 27, I added a 10% bump because those players are kind of entering their primes, but there's still some room for them to improve. Players 28 through 33, I said that they're in their prime, they're not going to change their production that much, so it remained the same. Players 34 to 37, I said that their production is going to dip by 10%, and then over 38 and over, I said was going to dip by 20%. So in essence, I just took each player's point share from previous seasons and then adjusted based on whether I think they're going to continue to improve or decline in the next year. From that, I got the expected point share of each player, add those all up for the projected starting roster, and then there you go. That's the projected point totals for each team. Now, I'm not going to give those point totals because some of them are absurd, like 130 points. And the reason that that's not realistic is because injuries happen, trades happen, players have down games. So these teams are not going to reach this peak. This model is assuming that every player is perfectly healthy for the entire season. So that's just not realistic. And so putting an actual point number out there doesn't make sense to me. But I did project those point totals out and have a prediction for the playoff picture entering the 2023-24 season. Again, this is assuming that every team is perfectly healthy. So some of the teams are higher than my projections or lower than my projections because they already have injuries. For instance, the Tampa Bay Lightning is a big one. Vasilevsky's out for a month or two. The Florida Panthers are also missing Ekblad and Montour for who knows how long. So for those teams, the injuries are not factored in, but I will make a note as we're going through that these teams are probably going to be a bit lower because they already are suffering from some significant injuries. But other teams are going to suffer injuries of their own, so it should all kind of even out in the wash. But anyway, here is my prediction for the final NHL standings, 2023-24. I'm going to do it a little differently. I'm not going to just go like 1 through 32 or 32 through 1. I'm actually going to go outside in because we know who the really good teams in the NHL are and who the not good teams in the NHL are, and we'll start with the good, with the top 4 teams who are all the 4 division winners. So number 1, the team that I project will win the President's Trophy this year with the best record is the Toronto Maple Leafs. I mean, this is just a dominant team. All of their best players are in or entering their prime. No excuse for the Maple Leafs to not be a great team this year. Next up, we've got the Central Division winners, the Edmonton Oilers. You have Draisaitl and McDavid, the most productive forward twosome in the entire NHL. If you can't win with them, I don't know what to tell you, Edmonton. All you need is a bunch of warm bodies around those two, and you should be a dominant team. Then we have the Pacific winning Dallas Stars. Dallas is a good team, really just no weaknesses. Ottinger's a great goalie, Robertson and Hintz, they've got some great defensemen. Dallas is going to be a really good team, even though they're in the same division as the defending Stanley Cup champions. And then finally, the Metro Division winners, that bunch of jerks, Carolina. Another team that is just built completely solid, no real holes in the lineup. I think they win the division. Now, after those two, there are 3 teams that I have in my quote-unquote elite division. These are teams that are close to those top 4 division winners in terms of points that I would say are, right now, in my opinion, the other true Stanley Cup contenders. I think any of those 4 teams I mentioned could win the Cup, but so can these 3. And I'm not going to give my Cup prediction now because injuries and trades are going to affect that. But right now, here are the other 3 teams who are going to make the playoffs, in my opinion, and be in the contention for the Stanley Cup. First of all, Colorado Avalanche. A year removed from winning the Stanley Cup, they were devastated by injuries, lost kind of a fluky first round to Seattle. They got outplayed a little bit, but they were also coming off of the Cup fatigue. I think they bounce back, and they're going to be a very strong team going up against Edmonton in the Central. After them, the second team in the Metro, the New York Rangers. Everybody's expecting it to be the Devils after the Hurricanes, but I think the Rangers are stronger. I have a lot of faith in Shesterkin. Their forward core is just absolutely loaded. They've got good, peaking young defensemen. Rangers are going to be a strong team this year. And then the third and final team that I put in the quote-unquote elite tier is the Boston Bruins. Everybody's sleeping on the Bruins because they lost Bergeron, Bertuzzi, Orlov, and all those guys. But I think their core, Pastrnak, Marchand, even though he's a bit of a rat, McAvoy, Lindholm, Coyle, all those guys, still a very good core. And their goaltenders, Swayman and Ullmark, are both elite, in my opinion. So that's the elite group. Now let's go down to the bottom feeders. Let's get the bad teams out of the way, the ones that we all know are not going to be very good, starting with the team that I project to be the worst in the entire NHL in the conversation for the Macklin Celebrini sweepstakes, the San Jose Sharks. Really just not a lot going on in San Jose. They're rebuilding, got a lot of young pieces. They're probably going to ship off guys like Couture and Hurdle before the season ends. In my opinion, they should, because they are multiple years away. After them, Chicago Blackhawks. They just got Connor Bedard. You would expect that they're going to jump very high, and I have Connor Bedard projected to have a season similar to that, like Crosby, McDavid, Austin Matthews, Ovechkin did in their first years, which are really good years. But the team around him is still complete ass. Chicago Blackhawks are not going to be even close to contending for the playoffs this year, maybe next year. Also down in the bottom tier, the Philadelphia Flyers. This is just a complete shit show of a team. They're going to reload. They're going to have a fire sale. Philly is not going to be a serious contender. They're going to be last in the Metro, in my opinion. Anaheim Ducks, also down in this tier. It's really shocking that you have two young guys who are so good, like Zegras and Troy Terry, and a goaltender like John Gibson, and you're this far down. Like, their depth is just non-existent, and their defense, other than Cam Fowler, is pretty atrocious. So the Ducks are going to be a top pick next year as well. And then my final team in this tier of basically teams that I think have no chance of making the playoffs whatsoever is the Montreal Canadiens. Their goaltending situation is a mess. Cole Caulfield and Nick Suzuki are good but not great players. They actually have, by my calculations, the worst forward core of any team in the NHL. I know I'm not Montreal fans' favorite person, and I might be underestimating guys like Caulfield, Suzuki, Slepkowski, but this team, in my opinion, is poised for another bottom 5 finish. Moving back up to the next tier of good teams, these are the ones that I would call the safe bets to make the playoffs and have cup potential. They're not my top picks to win the cup, but they're definitely going to be in the playoffs, and they're going to be in that conversation depending on how much they peak or not. And we'll start with the team that should have been in the elite division in a lot of people's eyes, the defending champs, Vegas Golden Knights. They're still an incredibly good team. My big issue with them is goaltending. Is Aiden Hill really that guy? Is Logan Thompson going to be that healthy? Is he that guy? Their forward core and defensive core are both among the best in the NHL. If they get average goaltending, they're among the elite, but I just can't go off of like the small sample size that I've seen. And that's the similar story to my other team that probably most people would have in their elite, which is the New Jersey Devils. Akira Schmidt was really good in the playoffs. Vitek Vanacek is a good, not great goaltender. If we can get some more out of Schmidt, if Vitek Vanacek continues to maintain his form, I think the Devils will be towards that elite tier, probably. But their forwards are really great, and even though they lost Severson in the offseason, I think their defense is still pretty good. Other teams in this tier making the playoffs, but probably not quite as close to the Stanley Cup. First, I got the Winnipeg Jets, especially now that they've re-signed Connor Hellebuyck. This was all under the assumption that Hellebuyck was going to be on the team because he is elite. He's like top 3 goalie. Now that they have him locked up along with Scheifele, I'll talk about that more in a little bit. I think the Winnipeg Jets are still in a great position. Love the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade from their perspective. They got a lot of really good players and pieces. I think the Jets made a very smart move last year to retool. And then last but not least in this tier of teams comfortably making the playoffs, but maybe not quite being cup contenders, I got the Vancouver Canucks. Really good forward core. Love Thatcher Demko. Quinn Hughes is a fucking star. They're also in a very light division because they're going to get to play the Sharks and the Ducks a bunch of times. So I really think that the Canucks are going to be in a great position to make the playoffs this year. Okay, now let's boop back down towards the bottom, fill out the other teams that I think are good, contending for the playoffs, but probably still not making it. And the first one that came up is a big surprise to me when I did it. I did the calculations twice, but I have the Seattle Kraken falling down, not making the playoffs this year. I mean, I love Matty Beniers, but they really do not have a lot else going on in terms of their depth. Tolvanen's still very good. Defensively, they're still a bit wanting, and Philip Grubauer in goal has been one of the worst goaltenders of the last few years. If he can regain this form, they have a chance, but right now, I don't think Seattle is going back to the playoffs. Right ahead of them, I got the Arizona Coyotes, a team that's, kind of trending upward, but the whole ownership situation, who knows what that's going to be like. Love Logan Cooley, love Clayton Keller. If they could fix the defense and get a goalie, they'd be in position. But, if I had wheels, I'd be a wagon.
One other team that I think will be competitive but not necessarily make it, St. Louis Blues. I think that they have a pretty decent defensive core. Forward core is a little more underwhelming in my opinion, but their big problem is goaltending. Jordan Binnington has just not been good since that cup run, and they don't really have a competent backup behind him. I think the Blues are really in that transition period where they did the full rebuild. They sold off their guys. They lost a lot of those key cogs of the cup run: Tarasenko, Pietrangelo, O'Reilly. I like a lot of their younger players. Stickly, though, they are lacking one or two significant difference makers up front, and they just don't have the goaltending that's going to be able to protect them when their defense does let up, because their defense is extremely good, I think. But I don't think that they have the goaltending to support it.
Another team that I have falling out and missing the playoffs is the Los Angeles Kings. Once again, the common theme here, goaltending. I do not trust in Cam Talbot and Phoenix Copley. They traded away a lot of their good young forwards in that Pierre-Luc Dubois trade, which I hated. In my opinion, should have held on to those guys, let their young guys develop a little bit more, kind of fill out that roster, and then maybe this offseason would be the one where you can make that splash trade. But I wouldn't have made it for a guy like Pierre-Luc Dubois, who has shown effort issues, and then you're paying him so much money. So I don't think Los Angeles is making the playoffs this year. We also got the Columbus Blue Jackets, a team that is going to do a little bit better than expected. A team with a sneaky good defensive core. I love the additions of Severson and Provorov. Werenski's a great player. Really hopeful. Well, not really hopeful because I'm in the division, but from their perspective, really hopeful that Fantilli develops and becomes the player that he is going to be. And I think that Anaheim made a huge mistake passing on him for Karlsson. But yeah, I could see the Blue Jackets giving some teams some trouble. Next in the probably not going to make the playoffs division, I got the Detroit Red Wings, and it's one word: goaltending. Everybody's coming back at me that, Billy Husso's actually a really good goaltender. This is a guy who has a career save percentage of .904, and twice has had a save percentage under 90. He had one pretty good year in St. Louis. Can he rebound to that? Then maybe Detroit has a chance. But from what I've seen so far of Ville Husso, I do not believe in him. I do not believe in him as a starting goaltender, and I do not believe in the Red Wings as a result. And then last but not least, of my teams that are still probably not making the playoffs, another shocker, the Eastern Conference champion Florida Panthers. And this, by the way, was with Ekblad and Montour in their lineup. Kind of like with the Red Wings, Bobrovsky, who played out of his mind in the playoffs, has been ass the last few years for Florida. Like I said in their preview video, they almost didn't make the playoffs last year, and if Pittsburgh hadn't shit all over themselves in the last two games, they wouldn't have made the playoffs. And they really did nothing to address their goaltending issues. Their defense got worse. I think that Florida is in for a big-time regression this year, even though Matthew Tkachuk is still him. Okay, so that leaves us with the last tier, which is teams that are going to be in the hunt for the playoffs. These are the other teams that are going to be either making the playoffs, in my opinion, or close to making the playoffs. So if your team's in here, they have a shot to make the playoffs. I'm not necessarily saying that the teams that I say won't make the playoffs just have no chance. They do have a chance. If they get hot, if they make the right trade, if they stay healthy, for sure. But if your team, suffers a big injury or, somebody falls off a cliff, they're not going to be in a great position. So these are the teams that are on the fringes, in my opinion. And we'll start at the very top with the Minnesota Wild. Really good goaltending. Really middle-of-the-pack forwards and defensemen. Kirill Kaprizov is great. I love him. Their defense I like a lot with guys like Spurgeon, Brodin, and Faber, but their depth is a little bit lacking. The third line, third pairing defensemen, not quite as good as you'd want them to be. That drags them down quite a bit. But I think Minnesota will make it as one of the wild cards out of the West. Then from the East in the Atlantic, I think it's going to be a real rock fight trying to get in, but the team I think will get in as the third team out of the Atlantic behind Toronto and Boston is the Ottawa Senators. Another team that I think really just does everything well: solid goaltending, good forward depth, good defensemen. I really like their top-end defensemen, actually. And then another team that I think is going to make it out of the East from the Metro Division, I got the New York Islanders. Really, goaltending is the big factor here. They've got two guys who are not only starters, in my opinion, in Semyon Varlamov and Ilya Sorokin, but two guys who could be high-end starters. I truly believe that. They are two exceptional goalies. Their defense is also sneaky good, sneaky underrated, and their forward core is respectable. I'm not going to say it's like one of the best, but it's, top 20. It's good enough. And if they can get good defense and good goaltending, I think the Islanders are going to be set and make it back to the playoffs. So 3 teams from each division in, plus 1 wild card from each of the 2 conferences. 1 playoff spot remaining amongst the teams that are still out there. So let's eliminate some right off the bat. And let's stick in the East because that's where most of the teams are. First team I've got out is the Tampa Bay Lightning. And this was before Andrei Vasilevsky went down for 2 months. Tampa Bay is extremely depleted. This is a team that is retooling. Their forward lines are not what they used to be. Their defense outside of Hedman and Sergachev is pretty unproven at best and bad at worst. And like I said, they have one of the worst goaltenders in the NHL. I know that Johansson had a really good first game. His body of work over his career does not make me feel comfortable in saying that this guy's going to be able to carry this team for 2 months. If they were a lesser team, I would almost predict that they're going to be out of it and selling early in the year, but they still have enough top-end talent on their forward lines, and they have 2 elite defensemen that I think they will be able to at least hang around, but they're going to be in too big of a hole, unfortunately. Missing Vasilevsky for that first bit of time, they're just not going to be able to catch up. If they stay ahead of the pack, or even with the pack, and Vasilevsky comes back, sure, I think it opens it up, but I just don't see that happening, unfortunately. Next team I have from the East not making it in. This team's going to be close, but I have the Buffalo Sabres missing. Their young goaltender, Devin Levi, a lot of promise, but just not proven enough. I don't know that he's going to jump into the NHL and immediately become elite, certainly not, but even above average. And they desperately need that because their defense is really suspect. Outside of Deline and Power, the rest of their guys are pretty brutal, if I'm being honest. Like Jokiharju, Samuelson, Johnson, those are not guys that I would trust on a team that is going to be trying to make the playoffs. They got really good forwards. They got high top-end talent. I think they're a year away. I think they just narrowly miss it. So that leaves 2 teams apiece in the West and the East that are battling for the last playoff spot. So we got in the West, the Flames and the Predators for the last playoff spot. I have the Predators making it in, the Flames missing. UC Soros is a great goaltender. Top 5-ish. Jacob Markstrom's not. The Flames goaltending trio is bottom 5 compared to the Predators, who are top 5. That is really the biggest difference. In terms of forwards and defensemen, they're actually very close. I give Nashville the edge on defense, Calgary the edge on forwards, but the discrepancy is really in goal. It's going to come down to that. Unless Jacob Markstrom morphs back into like 2021 form, I don't see the Flames really having the ability to keep up with Nashville. And then finally, out of the East, we've got bitter rivals, my Caps and the Pittsburgh Penguins, and I'm going to call my shot right now. Caps make it in, Pittsburgh doesn't. Pittsburgh misses the playoffs this year. And I'm going to tell you right now, these two are projected to have identical projected points. Even projected point totals over the 82 games that everybody remains healthy, and that's why I think the Caps get in over Pittsburgh. Last year, the Caps were one of the most injured teams in the NHL. They had the 4th most man games lost points due to injury, meaning they both lost a lot of players to injury, and they lost a lot of critical players to injury. They lost John Carlson, Nick Backstrom, Tom Wilson, DJ Oshie for extended periods of time. Pittsburgh Penguins, on the other hand, were right in the middle of the pack in terms of man games lost times point share lost due to injury. But most importantly, last year they got 82 games out of Crosby, Malkin, 64 games out of Letang, and 82 games out of their newest acquisition, Erik Karlsson. That's notable for Karlsson. This is the first time in 5 years he's played more than 60 games in a season. They were extremely healthy last year, and I don't think that's going to be the case this year. And the margin is just so small between them. Pittsburgh's got a better defense because of that top-end talent. They're very top-loaded. Letang, Karlsson, Crosby, Malkin, Gensel, Riley Smith, Rust, very big hitters. Caps are more balanced. They don't have the highs. It's Ovechkin and Karlsson are their 2 big guns, but they have a lot of guys in the middle. Oshie, Backstrom, Kuznetsov, Wilson, Milano, Strome. They're much better equipped to survive 1 or 2 serious injuries. Just last year, they caught 3 or 4 serious injuries, and they just didn't have the ability to keep up with that. And as a result, they sold off, which was the smart move. I think this year, the Caps get better injury luck. The Penguins don't get as good of injury luck. Their fortunes change. Pittsburgh misses this year. Because really, one injury to Letang, Malkin, Crosby, or Karlsson, this team is in big trouble. That is like 20% of their entire team's production in terms of projected points in 4 players. Gensel, it's almost a quarter. They lose one of those 5 guys, they are in big trouble. The Capitals, really, the only 2 players they can't afford to lose are Ovechkin and John Carlson, which they lost one of those last year. And Kemper. Neither team can afford to lose their starting goaltender. But yeah, that's why I think the Caps get into the playoffs as the last wildcard team, and the Pittsburgh Penguins miss. Like I said, though, if both teams remain perfectly healthy or injury luck is still bad for the Caps, they'll probably miss, because their 2 teams are projected to be dead even. But I just think one team got very lucky last year, one team got not as lucky last year. I think those fortunes are more likely to converge towards the mean. So to recap, my projected playoffs are Carolina gets in from the Metro with the Rangers, Devils, Islanders, Caps. In the Atlantic, Toronto wins, Bruins and Ottawa get in. In the Central, Edmonton wins with Colorado, the Winnipeg Jets, Minnesota Wild, and Nashville. And then out of the Pacific, Dallas wins the division, Vegas gets back in, and Vancouver gets in. And we'll check back at the end of the year to see if I am wrong, unless there's a lot of injuries or big trades happen. These are based on starting lineups, so big trades or injuries, I reserve the right to say that my predictions were bunk. Okay, third period, let's do some quick hitters from around the NHL and some listener questions. We're going to put out a call every week on Tuesday for listener questions, little post on the channel. If you're a subscriber, you get priority. If you donate or you're a super subscriber, whatever that thing is, you'll guarantee to have your question answered on the pod, but get priority to subscribers. Going to do 5 to 10 of these, depending on how many there are. Coyote Islanders says, even though you're a Caps fan, you're still one of the funniest hockey YouTubers I've seen. Thank you very much for that. Question, in your opinion, what's the ugliest hockey jersey? So I'm going to do some content over the course of the year about the ugliest jerseys, home, away, alternate, reverse retro, throwback, whatever have you. But for this one, I'm just going to do ugliest home and away jerseys. Some honorable mentions then for the home. I think that the Colorado Avalanche, it's kind of ugly, their home jerseys. Really don't like the Anaheim Ducks current home jerseys, and I'm also not a big fan of the Vegas Golden Knights home jerseys. But the team I will give as the worst home jerseys in the NHL right now is the Florida Panthers. Could you pick 2 colors that contrast and clash much more than these? I mean, dear God. Awful, I hate the Florida Panthers New Jersey. Go back to the old Panther one. And then for worst away jerseys, I gotta say my Caps away jersey is pretty bad. Florida's is also pretty bad, their away jerseys. And the Canucks, I really don't like their away jerseys, even though I do like their home jerseys. But the worst away jerseys, in my opinion, belong to the Los Angeles Kings. So bland. Just black and white. It's so bland. Add a little bit of color. The all blacks for home look really cool. Add a little bit color to your away whites, please. Silver Dragon 996 asks, who is the most underrated defenseman in the league? Be one of the top guys who don't get enough credit. For me, that's McAvoy and Miro, or it could be a random middle pair guy. I feel like your answer is going to be TVR, which is a Hawks fan I totally get. It's not going to be TVR. Trevor Van Riemsdyk is not one of my favorite defensemen for the Caps, even though I know that you have a little affection for him from his time in Chicago. I'll throw out a few names. One guy who I feel like just never gets enough respect is Chris Letang from the Penguins. He's been legitimately a top pairing defenseman for a while now, and it feels like everybody just overlooks that for some reason. Incredibly stout defensively, like more than people give him credit for, and also, great puck-moving defenseman. I mean, him and Karlsson might be one of the best tandems in the NHL. Other guys who I think don't get enough shine, Hampus Lindholm of the Boston Bruins does not get enough credit. He is a first pairing guy who's being asked to play on the second pair because Boston is so loaded on defense. He's a really good player. Really like him a lot. Gustafsson of the New York Rangers is obviously a guy I'm very familiar with from last year in Washington. He's super underrated. Another guy who was a big deal a while ago and fell off the face of the map. I feel like everybody forgot that Shane Gostisbehere is a really good defenseman. Like, he's not a top pairing guy, but he's very much a second pairing guy. Great puck movement. Not the greatest in his own zone. Not that stout defensively, but not as bad as a lot of people think. And he more than makes up for it in his transition game and being able to work the point, play power play time. I think Shane Gostisbehere is a good defenseman.
Not great, but good. And I feel like a lot of people, especially after his exit from Philly, think that he's like terrible.
Okay, so let's do some news from around the NHL. Quick hitters. The Winnipeg Jets made news by re-signing both Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuck to 7-year deals. Great deal on both counts in my opinion, but especially more significant for Connor Hellebuck. The is he going, is he staying was a whole saga throughout the offseason. Now he's staying. And his comments about why he chose to say about the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade and how they weren't signaling that they were rebuilding really made me respect him a lot more, because he's a guy who kind of gets it, understands the big picture, and sees that the Jets could have taken the road to rebuild, but also sees that they got a lot of good value out of that trade. So, great job by the Jets keeping those two guys locked up. Scheifele is obviously one of the leaders in that locker room, one of their most explosive offensive players, keeping him locked up another 7 years. Yeah, the age is going to get to be a concern towards the end, but I still think it's a really good deal for them on both counts. The NHL itself made news by banning Pride tape this season. This follows their decision to ban the Pride jerseys. Well, not just Pride jerseys. That was a ban on all themed jerseys in warm-ups like Military Appreciation, St. Patrick's Day, etc. But this one seems to be a little bit more targeted. And I've been really heartened, honestly, to see how many NHL players have spoken up in opposition to this decision. Guys like Scott Laughton, Connor McDavid, Morgan Riley, Anthony Duclair, Brad Marchand. As much as I might hate him, he spoke out against it. All of that is great, really heartening to see, but it is disappointing that a sport that brands itself as being for everyone, hockey is for everyone, and is desperately trying to gain a foothold in terms of its audience, is so reticent to reach out to underrepresented groups like LGBTQ groups. I think it's definitely fair if guys like the Stalls or James Reimer don't want to participate. They shouldn't be forced to. I think that's perfectly fair if they don't want to. And I don't think that we should be, coming down too harsh on it if their explanation is just, hey, I don't want to participate, but people are free to do whatever they want. I'm not going to deprive anybody of their rights, their freedoms. Just me personally, I don't want to participate. I think that's totally cool. And if the NHL had just said, hey, we're not going to make them mandatory. If you want to do them, people can participate. That's fine. But to ban it sends a pretty loud and clear message. And I'm really hoping that the NHL will reconsider, because we need as many fans watching hockey as we can get. And this is taking away eyeballs from that and adding scrutiny that we don't need. The Buffalo Sabres locked up Rasmus Dahlin and Owen Power to long-term extensions. Really don't have anything to say about this except a very good job for the Sabres on both counts. They got a lot of value out of this. They signed long-term deals, projecting out that these two guys are going to be centerpieces on their defense for a long time, which I think is very fair. I criticized the Cole Caulfield signing because I didn't think his production had quite warranted that level of a price tag. But I think for Power and for Dahlin, it is justified. So, good move by the Sabres, locking those two guys up. I think they're going to earn out those contracts, especially as the cap goes up. TNT made headlines for putting up kind of a silly graphic after Connor Bedard scored his first goal. Congrats to him, by the way. Putting him in the chase, quote unquote, behind Wayne Gretzky. Gretzky's 894, Bedard at 1. Everybody got all up in arms. As somebody who works in media, let me tell you that's exactly the reaction they wanted to get. Everybody talking about how silly is this? Congratulations, you fell right into their trap. But here I am talking about it, so I guess I did too. But in a sense, I kind of feel bad for Bedard, because he's just under so much pressure and so much expectations. Like, if he is not McDavid, Crosby, Ovechkin, Austin Matthews, like, almost immediately, I feel like that's a lot of people are going to be questioning him, which is unfair for an 18-year-old kid. I would also like to point out that Bedard says he's never had, junk food or candy, which to me is insane. I mean, Alex Ovechkin drinks a Coke before every game. Kid, I get you want to be healthy, you want to keep your performance optimized, but, for the love of God, you can have, a candy bar every now and then. It's not the end of the world. I hope in the NHL, being around some other guys, some looser guys, they'll lighten him up, because he seems like a good kid. I just, hope that he is getting to take in the experience of being in the NHL, and him forgetting the stick before warm-ups was kind of cute and endearing. And I've heard at some of his interviews, he went out spitting chiclets, Pat McAfee, all that stuff. He seems like a very well-spoken young man, good kid. I just, want him to be able to enjoy this time because, if we forget these kids are 18. He's 18 years old, can't drink, can't, rent a car, things that us adults take for granted. And, at that time, you're kind of an idiot and you should be able to kind of F around and make mistakes. So I hope Connor Bedard is enjoying his time being in the NHL, and I hope the pressure doesn't get to be too big on him. And last but not least, a funny story, Thatcher Demko apparently got sick during his debut for the Vancouver Canucks and threw up in his goalie mask. These guys play through a lot, got Deshaun Watson not playing in the football games this weekend because he's got a little soreness. Thatcher Demko's out there puking in his mask. I didn't even know. Nobody even saw it because he kept it bottled up in the mask somehow. I don't know how that didn't leak or anything. I hope he got off the ice, but I think it came out after the game, so that's pretty remarkable. The fact that he kept it for anybody from noticing it for that long is honestly even more impressive than any save he's made in the game. So Thatcher Demko, you're a warrior. Drink some Pepto to celebrate. Good on you, Pete. Moving on to Overtime, this is a segment where I talk about something unrelated to hockey, so if you're just here for a hockey fix, you can dip out now. I'll see you next time. But for the rest of you, let's talk about the Israeli-Palestine conflict. No, I'm just kidding. Not going to talk about something that heavy. Let's talk about something that's a lot less divisive. The Star Wars prequels. Back when I was a kid, I liked Star Wars. I didn't love it. My little brother loved Star Wars. Always dressed up as Darth Vader. Went and saw every movie the night it came out. I was a fan, but I wasn't, obsessed with Star Wars the way he was. And over the recent years, I kind of kept up with it, but I fell out of favor a little bit. I kind of stopped watching around the time of Obi-Wan, Mandalorian Season 3-ish. So I'm a little behind on that, but I hadn't done a proper Star Wars rewatch in a while. And I was kind of feeling burned out on the MCU. Been a little bit down recently. The DC is, God only knows what's going on with that. The Fast and the Furious franchise is, it's basically live action anime at this point. So I thought, you know what? I got some time on my hands. I'm going to do a full-on Star Wars rewatch. Chronological order, beginning to end, all the stuff that's considered canon, which I know is a lot with the Clone Wars and Rebels and all that jazz. But I'm going to give it a shot because I haven't watched all of it and I haven't done a full rewatch. So started with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And it's been a while, I've seen a lot of discourse around the prequels that people are coming around, being less harsh on them, a lot of nostalgia going on. I hadn't seen the prequels in God knows how long, probably 5-10 years maybe, not since I was in college maybe. So I went and watched The Phantom Menace on Disney Plus for the first time in a while, remembering what happened, but not really remembering the specifics and the details. And dear God, that movie is an absolute abomination. Train wreck. It is terrible, awful. I know that people are harsh on the MCU with Secret Invasion, Quantumania, and stuff like that. Those look like Citizen Kane compared to The Phantom Menace. That movie is god awful. And I'll just talk about exactly why on my first rewatch in forever of The Phantom Menace. I couldn't make it through. I had to stop and finish it a few days later because I was so incredulous at how bad this movie was from a franchise that's supposed to be the gold standard of Hollywood. So first of all, I forgot that the main conflict in this movie is basically a giant trade embargo. So this is all a bunch of tax law and politics. At some point I thought that Bernie Sanders was going to show up in the Galactic Senate and, Jim Jordan was going to threaten a government shutdown or something like that. The main conflict of the movie, for those who don't remember, is that the Galactic Trade Federation wants to blockade the planet Naboo so that they can get a better trade deal. In reality, there's a bigger picture. Senator Palpatine's pulling strings behind the scene, but the movie basically starts with the two Jedi, Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, going to negotiate a trade agreement, and the Trade Federation betrays them. Why? God only knows. They end up stranded on Naboo. They run into Jar Jar Binks, who is racist, but I don't understand how. Like, I heard his voice, the way he spoke, the mannerisms, and I was like, this is offensive to somebody. I don't know who, but somebody should be offended at this. Maybe it's just all of humanity should be offended at this, that this is something that was on our screens, because he is, dear God, the worst character I've ever seen. He fails upward like Donald Trump Jr. levels of just failing upward. And so the Jedi go and they rescue the Queen from the droid army. They escape Naboo. They end up on Tatooine because her hyperdrive was destroyed or something like that. They needed to get a part. They needed to find a mechanic. Yada, yada, yada. They meet Anakin Skywalker. He has to do a pod race so that they can get the part. Republic credits don't work on Tatooine. There's no sort of like kiosk where you can exchange them for whatever Tatooine currency they have. You know, you would think that somebody out there would be able to exchange the credits for whatever the Tatooine currency is. But, Anakin does the pod race. He wins. They get the part. Anakin gets freed. His mother gets left behind. He's very sad. He meets Padme, who's Queen Amidala, but we don't know that. They go to the Space UN, who's completely useless. Padme/Queen Amidala falls into Senator Palpatine's trap and gets them to remove the head of the Space UN, replace him with Palpatine so he can begin his climb up the ladder, Littlefinger style. They go back to Naboo. Why? Nothing's really changed since the time that they fled. They just decided that they're going to go back and free them. They have no additional weapons, armies, or strategic advantage they didn't have before. They're just going to go back and try and wing it. And sure enough, they stumble across the Gungans, the underwater people that they hate. They make peace immediately. The Naboo and the Gungans fight the droid army. They win. They banish the Trade Federation representatives back to the Galactic UN to stand in front of the UN committee hearings. Get a slap on the wrist. So that's the plot of Phantom Menace. Oh, there's also Darth Vader's after them trying to kill the Jedi under Emperor Palpatine's command. It's not really clear why. Like, they win and everything works out for Palpatine. It's not really clear why he was so insistent on Darth Maul going to kill the two of them. It's not like he was trying to get Anakin. He didn't really know about him. But Darth Maul's cool. There were a few parts of this movie that actually had me rolling my eyes ridiculously. The first one being, I don't know if you remember, but there's that critical scene where the Naboo end up back on their home planet. They meet the Gungans. It's revealed that Padme, the assistant to the Queen, who was on Tatooine with Qui-Gon and Anakin, is actually the Queen herself. Now, why did she have to pretend to be somebody else when she could have just stayed back on the ship, assistant to go with Qui-Gon Jinn? Who knows? She says it's for her protection, but she immediately just gives up the disguise the minute she goes in front of the Gungans. So why even try this deception? There's no point to it if you're going to immediately give it up. And also, it doesn't even serve the purpose of protecting her because she immediately throws herself into harm's way by going into the battle with the Jedi. But that's not even the dumbest part. The dumbest part is that they bring Anakin, a 10-year-old kid, to the war with them. And I don't want to hear this whole, well, there's no one else safer for them to... It's a planet. Put him literally anywhere away from the battle, on a ship with one other person. Stick Jar Jar Binks with him to babysit him. I don't know. Anything is smarter than bringing him to war, but instead we have Anakin fumbling his way around in a spaceship that he's never flown before and managing to blow up the, mind control of the droids. And on the ground, Jar Jar Binks is the general for the Gungans. Yeah, by the way, Jar Jar Binks, his backstory is that he was exiled by the Gungans for being clumsy. And because he managed to bring Qui-Gon Jinn, the Naboo, to the Gungans and they made peace, they promoted him to general. All he did was give them directions, and they made him the guy that they exiled for being too clumsy, general in the biggest battle that their people has ever had. Make it make sense. Somebody please make it make sense. But beyond the writing just being nonsensical, the CGI was pretty bad. And I don't want to hear that this is, it's 25 years ago. This came out 2 years before Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. A movie that looks infinitely better. Jurassic Park came out 5 years before this movie. 6 years, I think, actually. And Jurassic Park still holds up well. This movie looked like dog shit. Like, everybody bashes, Quantum Mania for the wonky CGI. That shit looks 10 times better than this. Like, this CGI was bad. And also, the acting. Natalie Portman is an incredibly talented actor. She was terrible in this. Liam Neeson, very talented actor. Terrible. Like, I swear to God, after every take, George Lucas's feedback must have been, that was great. Could you do it with a little less emotion? Could you do it a little blander? Like, you're at the DMV, like you're a wall who's talking to a wall. Like, just emote as little as possible. And they really ran with it. Like, I know everybody gave shit to the little kid Jake Lloyd who played Anakin. He was one of the better actors on that set. And that's not because he's the most talented, but it's because everybody else set the bar so goddamn low. So yeah, anyway, Phantom Menace sucked. Darth Maul is awesome. The pod racing scene was cool. 2 out of 10. I'm going to watch the Attack of the Clones next, which somehow I've heard is even worse. I don't really remember Attack of the Clones so much. But if you want to hear me review that movie, feel free to drop a comment and let me know, because this overtime period is going to be just my ramblings on things in pop culture, other sports, what have you. But thank you for joining me for this edition of Puck Around and Find Out. I'm the Rink Rat. Peace.